I think I like the words that Professor Robin Lane from Oxford University used recently when he was out here to Australia. He described democracy, modern democracy, as weasel democracy. And I think what he meant by that is, if you conceive of modern democracy being founded, if you like, at the time of the American Declaration of Independence in the 1780s, so some 250 years ago, it was very much modelled on the British model, actually, and they refused to use the very word democracy. The American founding fathers described their republic as a natural aristocracy, and in fact it was really no different to the British one, except it didn't have a king. Their parliaments were constituted by the landed gentry, by how would you call them, the sort of the rich and the good, and that was not inclusive. That was not the way democracy was originally conceived. So they did not want to use the word democracy because that referred to the Greek model. So for 50 odd years they refused to use the very word democracy for their model, for their republic. And then they basically stole it. It's not democracy as it was originally conceived. Democracy was originally conceived to have rich and poor, not just the grandees, the old grandees, the landed gentry, but to have rich and poor. And the Americans, as the British, they basically used the Roman model for elections and electioneering and candidates and contested spaces. And so in that process, only the rich had the capacity to actually fund their campaigns or be articulate or win over. And in fact, for much of the early modern democracy, as we know, whether it was in the UK or America or anywhere else, the votes were bought. And they're still bought in the developing countries now. I think it is part of the system, in a sense. So I think most politicians start off well-meaning and hard-working, and they are, in their own, even as elected people, still hard-working and well-meaning. But they are compromised from the very outset by their campaigning, because they have to basically put one imperative above every other, and that imperative is the electioneering imperative. They have to win and retain office, even at the cost of good government. So if that means they have to use wedge politics, they have to use small target strategy, they have to use personal vilification, that's all part of the game. So really, and it's got even worse. It's exacerbated now because, as I said, since those really deep ideological distinctions have effectively merged or evaporated, or whatever you like to say. I mean, what is the labour cause anymore? What is the free enterprise cause anymore? I mean, everyone recognises you've got to have trade-offs happening here. So what happens now is that these people in the last 30, 40 years have basically lost their principles and are scratching at whatever they can scratch at to manufacture their distinction, to manufacture their differences. And so it becomes hyper rhetoric, histrionics, and the media love it. And so it actually is it's sort of fuel to the fire. So that's all we get to hear. We actually hear these histrionics, and we don't hear much in the way of deliberation. And these guys don't actually want to have deliberation because collaboration is not part of the game. That's not what they're interested in. They're interested in wedging the other guys so they can win office. First experience of real politic, if you like, was when I was the age of 12, and I was living near a park at Clontarf in the northern suburbs here, the northern beaches. And in this park was a sewage pumping station, a big structure, big concrete structure. And there was a graffiti on the wall of this big shit house. And the graffiti was, "Don't vote, it only encourages them." And for me at the time, you know, as a 12-year-old, I thought, oh, that's pretty anarchic. It's funny, and it's obviously, you know, trying to sort of take the mickey out of the political class. Somehow, some 50 years later, I think it's got more resonance, actually. Now, look, the system is what the system is. I'm suggesting the system is broken, it's actually reached its use-by date, and it needs to be reinvented. Now, if you wanted to vote, then a colleague of mine has suggested, okay, let's have another box on that ballot paper, and let's call it none of the above, and let's tick that. I think, you know, none of this is perfect. None of this is perfect, but what we're trying to do is build inclusiveness. We want to make people feel that they have trust in the process. At the moment, trust is actually reducing. We've got to a point where, if you look at the surveys, generally trust in politicians has been on a gradual decline for the last 50 years post-war. And it's got even worse, as I say now, because the party politics are self-serving. And I think what's also happened is that people think, oh, well, there's all of this now populist movements happening, whether it's in the UK with UKIP or Spain with Podemos or in the US with Trump and Sanders. But what are they doing? They're ending up, potentially if they get into government, they'll be no better than the current lot, in the sense that, in this sense, you know what Cameron's outcome in the last election was? You know, the big winner in the last UK election was the non-voter. Over a third of the electorate did not vote in the UK, and Cameron, the Conservative Party, got less than a third of the vote. So you'll always have a third of the electorate, if you like. So not, you know, the electorate base. Obviously, not everyone votes in the UK. There's no compulsory election, but you'll always have this aspect of the so-called government in power, which you can have even had here in Australia. The Liberal Party is not a majority. They don't represent a majority of the voters. So you'll always have a bigger group outside of the government that in fact are not represented, who feel that they're not represented. So you'll always have this populist ranting, complaining, saying they're not representing me. So this whole exercise of voting, even though it looks like it's going to be somehow these are the new saviours, these parties such as Podemos or Rump or whoever, actually they're even less inclusive than the current lot.